Hello, this is John Smith. I'm the minister with the Church of Christ in Weyburn, Saskatchewan, and this is the Psalming Effect. Welcome to the Psalming Effect for this week of Monday, May the 24th. Today is Victoria Day in Canada, and today the Psalming Effect that I'd like to share with you draws from one of the Psalms that is a lengthier psalm, and so I'm only going to read a few verses from it. And so you might, if you follow along in your own copy of the scriptures, it'll be Psalms 78, verses 5 through 8. But before I get there, I actually want to set up an illustration with you. This psalm talks about generational attitude, okay? And when I was doing a little bit of preparation for a lesson I gave on this chapter and the whole idea of generational attitude, I found out that there's actually another meaning to another use in the English language of the word attitude. It's actually a technical term that's used in aeronautics. And so I just want to use that as an illustration for a moment. Now, I don't have a model airplane to do this with, but I have a little model car. So I'm going to try and illustrate what attitude is, at least in aeronautical terms, with a car. You just have to pretend this is a flying machine. So attitude, when you're talking about an airplane, has to do with its position, really, in the sky. And when you think about it, an airplane, as it's moving, as it's up in the air, off of the ground, there are basically three different axes that control or define its attitude, or its position, if you wish. And so the plane can either be tilted up or down from front to back like that. So that's kind of one aspect of attitude. Another aspect of attitude is that the plane can be tilted either tilted to the right or to the left in relationship to the horizontal direction it's facing. So that's another aspect that defines attitude. And a third axis that defines attitude is whether the plane is twisted on sort of a central vertical axis one way or the other. And the combination of and it depends on whose definition of aeronautical attitude you're reading. It either takes into account two, or in some writers define aeronautical attitude by all three of those axes. And this is important, as you can well imagine. The attitude or the body position of an airplane is important at various times, well, probably at all times during its flight, but especially when it's getting ready for a landing. If you think about it, I'm going to use my flat arm as the landing pad. If a plane is coming down to land, how do you want it facing? What kind of attitude will it have? You don't want it tilting right or left that way. You don't want the tip up too high, or certainly not the tip pointing into the ground. And so there's that aspect of attitude. And you also don't want it landing at an angle sideways in any direction either. You want it to have the proper attitude as the landing gear is hitting the ground when it's landing. So attitude is very important, aeronautical attitude, for the safe flight and especially landing of an aircraft. And my little model car is a Javelin, which, javelins fly through the air, but this is not an aircraft. But that illustrates something very important about attitude. Of course, when we talk about attitude, we're usually not thinking about aeronautics. We're thinking about attitude of the mind. Well, attitude of the mind is very important. Listen to these verses in Psalm 78, verses 5 through 8, which talks about the attitude of a generation in which this psalmist lived. He established a decree in Jacob and appointed a law in Israel, which he commanded our ancestors to teach their children, that the next generation might know them, the children yet unborn, and rise up and tell them to their children, so that they should set their hope in God, and not forget the works of God, but keep his commandments, and that they should not be like their ancestors, a stubborn and rebellious generation, a generation whose heart was not steadfast, whose spirit was not faithful to God. So the psalmist is talking about what his generation should try and pass on and instill in the next generation, their children, and even in the next generation after that, their children, a generation yet unborn. But a warning he gives is that they should try and instill a different mindset, a different attitude than their ancestors had. So a previous generation he refers to, and that generation he refers to as being a stubborn and rebellious generation. That is a description of attitude. And the problem with that attitude that earlier generation had, stubborn and rebellious, meant that they didn't follow good direction. They didn't follow leadership. They didn't follow God's direction. They didn't follow the leaders that God sent their way to try and lead them into the right paths. Instead, they were very stubborn and they were very rebellious. They had an attitude. We use that expression, don't they? They had an attitude, and it wasn't a good one. So we should think about our attitude and what kind of attitude we have, not just our generation, although I think it is helpful to identify what our generation's attitude is, and if we need to be a shining light of something good in the midst of a generation with a bad attitude, then that's what we need to do. But here's just a couple of suggestions. Well, they're not just suggestions. They're passages from the New Testament which describe to us the kind of attitude that we really ought to have as people of God. The first passage is in 1 Peter 5, verses 5 and 6. In the same way, you who are younger must accept the authority of the elders. That almost sounds like a generational thing, doesn't it? And all of you must clothe yourselves with humility in your dealings with one another. For God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Humble yourselves, therefore, under the mighty hand of God, so that he may exalt you in due time. Cast all your anxiety on him, because he cares for you. So there you see there's an attitude of humility that's important to have. That makes you leadable and teachable. That allows an older generation to provide good leadership to a younger generation. And also that puts you in proper submission to God. Then there's this passage in Philippians 2, verses 1 through 5. If there is any encouragement in Christ, any consolation from love, any sharing in the Spirit, any compassion and sympathy, make my joy complete Be of the same mind, having the same love, being in full accord and of one mind. Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility regard others as better than yourselves. Let each of you look not only to your own interests, but to the interests of others. Let the same mind, and some translations use the word attitude here, let the same mind be in you that was in Christ Jesus. And then it goes on in the subsequent verses to talk about how Jesus humbled himself to come to this earth in human flesh and to be a servant, to die a sacrificial death on behalf of everyone else. So, aeronautical attitude is important for a plane to be in correct flight position for a safe landing. Okay, that was our illustration. But it's important for us to also have the correct attitude, which allows us to be teachable and leadable, rather than a stubborn and rebellious attitude, which the generation of the psalmist, or at least the previous generation of the psalmist, was warning about. And this attitude that makes for unity with one another is the attitude of humility. It is the attitude of personal sacrifice, so perfectly modeled for us by Jesus. So these are all thoughts that come from Psalm 78, and that's just the first section of the psalm. This psalm is chock full of things to meditate on and think about, and I hope you will spend time there all throughout this week, and that it will have a psalming effect on your whole week. And remember, in thinking about Jesus, that in 21, he's still the one.